to talk about the Lansing General Strike, which was June 7th, 1937. First, I just wanted to say something about history. Like, I got involved in history because I thought it was interesting, and I enjoyed knowing a bunch of trivia that other people didn't know. And it was like fun to like read these little anecdotes from the past. But gradually, I just came around to thinking about history more in terms of how it affected what I was doing in my daily work and my political activity, and the way it illuminates what our possibilities are, and kind of can affect our collective amnesia over like what is possible or what is not possible. Because today a lot of things seem impossible that 60 years ago seemed very possible. And I think that if we can recapture some of the hope or the possibilities that were available, we can actually move things forward. The Lansing General Strike was kind of towards the end of a labor upsurge that began in the 1930s. Actually began in probably the late 1920s. That was partially a result of the Great Depression and partially a result of changes within the work life of Americans, the switch to industrialization and moving away from craft unionism. The 1930s saw some of the most dramatic labor disputes. 1934, 3 years before the Lansing General Strike, was probably the high point. There was a general strike in San Francisco, major general strike in Minneapolis, the Toledo Auto Light strike, which was essentially a general strike that saw several thousand workers fighting with a couple of thousand National Guardsmen in Toledo. And there was a national textile strike in 1934 that encompassed most of the East Coast and a great part of the American South. In 1935, the National Labor Relations Act was passed, which was the first time officially legal for workers to organize under law. And a lot of organizers took up the cry that Franklin Delano Roosevelt wants you to join a union. So they used that for organizing. After that, 1936 started the beginning of the sit-down strikes, first in the rubber industry and then into the auto industry. In 1937 was when the Flint sit-down strikes were, just up the road from us, not very far. In February, the strike was ended, settled by the Michigan governor, Frank Murphy, who was sympathetic to labor and acted as a mediator in the strike. And it was a success. The UAW won recognition from General Motors for their Flint operations. Down the road here in Lansing, there was quite a big stir to try to keep it from spreading here. The State Journal was running ads by General Motors saying that no labor dictator would ever take power in Lansing, and that no one had anything to worry about. Everything was going to just remain fine. But then in March, there was a sit-down strike at the Rio plant in Lansing. Unlike the Flint strike, where the police used tear gas and clubs to try to remove the workers from the factories, at Rio it actually went along pretty peaceful. I mean, there was a couple of thousand workers on strike, camped out in the Rio plant, and the police didn't attack. The Lansing police, the Lansing local government did not back the corporation, did not send the police in to run them out. And the governor, again, mediated the strike, and they won recognition there. So suddenly there were 15,000 United Auto Workers in Lansing. The organizing that began in smaller factories like Motor Wheel, Lansing Stamping, things that eventually all become part of General Motors, but were independent at that time. Went ahead very quickly. And then a place called Capital City Wrecking. The 25 workers there decided they wanted to join the UAW too, and they went in and signed cards and elected officers and presented their demands to management, which promptly fired all 6 of the officers. And that started a strike there. The picketing was 24 hours. They set up tents on site on the company property to hold the picket line and make sure no scabs got across. And the owner of the company went and got a court injunction and told them that they had to leave, and of course they didn't leave. And then he started to put pressure on the county sheriff, Hingham County Sheriff, to do something about this court order that he had, saying that they had to leave his private property. And the county sheriff didn't really have the muscle to move in and move 150 strikers out of there, so he decided to do a midnight or a late night raid. So at 2 a.m. he raided the houses of leading UAW officers and arrested them. He arrested including the wife of the president of the UAW local. The president at the time was in Detroit in a meeting and got back at 2:30 a.m. and found his house wide open, his children left unattended, and news that his wife was in jail. You know, I mean, did not sit well, I guess. So the next day, he got together with all of the factory chair people of all the local UAW shops, and they decided they were going to call a labor holiday for that day. It was Monday, June 7th, and there was going to be no work in Lansing on that day. And this was in the wee hours in the morning, and so by the time businesses were opening up, there were thousands of union members on the streets. This was like an innovative use of vehicles in Lansing at that time. They used trucks and cars to block the streets. They blocked all incoming traffic, put a picket line around the state building, picket line around City Hall, picket line around the police station. The state legislature even had to close. The City Hall closed before noon because they couldn't get in, they couldn't get out, so they just decided they would go along with it. Union members walking down the streets of downtown Lansing, some carrying flags, some carrying 2x4s, and they were serious about what they were doing, even though they were having fun too. Supposedly there was a big dice game in the middle of Michigan Avenue in Washington. They blocked off the area and they were shooting craps in the intersection. Apparently the only businesses that they left open were the bars and watering holes, which they continued to patronize. Well, it didn't take long for Governor Murphy, who had mediated all these other strikes, to step in and mediated this one too, and all the prisoners were let out of Hingham County Jail and freed. And so essentially the strike was pretty much done. This was in the early afternoon, but by mid-afternoon the strikers wanted to extend the general strike into East Lansing, so they loaded up cars and these flying squads, which was made up of Lansing workers and workers from Flint and Pontiac and just about every other area in the state that had UAW workers, and they headed to East Lansing to shut down the businesses. And at Harrison, Michigan, they were met by a large mob of MSU students who wouldn't let them through. And there was a fight, and some of the workers were beat up and thrown into the Red Cedar River. Meanwhile, at the same time, other workers went in down Grand River and were going along shutting down the businesses, moving down Grand River, closing, and until they came to some a bootery, a shoe store, that was owned by a former MSU linebacker who gathered together a vigilante group, and they fought against the strikers and threw some of them in the river too. So that was it. Now, what does that say? I mean, this was 1937. Children of the working class did not go to college. I mean, the children that were in there were the children of the middle class. Working class children or working class families would not see their kids going to college until after the war, when the financial aid program, like the first one, the GI Bill, made it possible for working class people to get into college. I mean, on a large scale. So we had like the children of privilege and the workers battling it out in a strange, bizarre little footnote to history in Lansing. In the aftermath of the strike, the UAW leadership, a month later, completely disavowed the Lansing General Strike, said it was just an immature, bad idea on the part of a young organization that was unable to control its members. Basically, it hadn't centralized its power enough to be able to impress on its members that they had to toe some kind of a bureaucratic line. And in Lansing, even though one of the strangest things was that while in San Francisco, Minneapolis, Toledo, all these places were marked by huge violent confrontations, I mean bloody confrontations where people got killed. And shortly after this in Chicago, the Memorial Day massacre in Chicago, 10 workers were shot down by the police in the Little Steel strike. But in Lansing, there was no bloodshed, there was no violence, which was really just an odd thing during this particular period. And one of the ideas is that it could be because this was like such a community. I mean, working people at the time, working people and their bosses weren't that far apart. The neighborhoods were pretty close. I mean, you could live down the street from the guy that owned the factory. I mean, Ari Old still lived in town. All these people still lived in like a very small area. So like that kind of bloody confrontation was less likely because you knew the people. It's like this wasn't a matter of an abstraction or some kind of symbolic act. It's like that would have been like messing up your house. These people had a community. So that was one of and plus most of them were from rural farming backgrounds. They had come into work in the industrial centers within a generation or less. Many of them, all their family roots were still in the country. Lansing's reaction to the general strike was the business community responded by forming a law and order committee that was made up of the American Legion and any local people who wanted to make sure that this union mob rule did not take place at any time in the future. And all the outside agitators they were talking about were mostly people that lived 3 or 4 blocks away. So, but that was the story of the Lansing General.